Good evening. Good evening. Hi there, my name is Mike Tierney. I'm the director of the Global Research Institute. Welcome. I'm thrilled to have you all here tonight for this conversation between my colleague, Steve Hansen, and our special guest tonight, Professor Francis Fukuyama. I'm sad that we had such a small turnout. I don't know if you can hear, but there's a riot brewing out in the hall, so it's good that you came early. And so, yeah, we tried to get Kaplan, but the athletics department would not give it to us. So my colleague who organized this event, Candace Vincent, tells me that the event is being recorded. And so I guess that doesn't really matter for you all since you're here, unless you want to watch it again. But for your friends who complain that they couldn't come, you can tell them, they're literally trying to batter down the doors. You can tell them they can watch it on YouTube. So anyway, onward. Steve Hansen is he's the one who looks like a power forward with the Horace Grant glasses on.
It's for cataract surgery, but oh well.
Steve, he's really a power forward. He's the Letty Pate Evans Professor of Government, and he was previously William & Mary's Vice Provost for International Affairs. Steve has written dozens of books and articles on comparative politics, Russian politics, and foreign policy. And most recently, he's written what I would call a prescient but depressing book that he wrote in October. It was published in October of 2024. It's called The Assault on the State. And to say that it is prescient is an understatement. It is remarkable. It starts in Russia, and it takes you on a trip around the world to look at a series of countries that have undergone a transition from, towards, it's not really democracy and authoritarianism, but towards a variant of populism. So I would strongly recommend it to you. Francis Fukuyama is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and the Mosbacher Director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. He's written or edited 11 books, including a best-selling and seminal book that has probably been assigned to all of you. It was assigned to me when I was a student. It's probably been assigned to all of you, and it is cautiously entitled The End of History. My own favorite is his 1995 tome, Trust, which shaped my own thinking on the foundations for collaboration and social stability. It's worth a read. It's really held up after 30 years. In fact, the central thesis, I think, is more central to 2025 even than to 1995. I'd like to thank two people before we start. First, Paul Verkuyl. Paul Verkuyl is the former president of William & Mary, and he's close friends with Frank, and they're working on a project together. He introduced me, and I think Steve, to Frank within the last year, and it's been great to integrate Frank into our intellectual community here at William & Mary. Most importantly, I'd like to thank Frank Fukuyama. By my count, this is his 7th meeting or event that he's participated in today. So Frank, thanks for your generosity and your wisdom and your stamina. So Frank, I'm going to turn it over to you for comments for about 20 minutes, and then there'll be a conversation, and then Steve will invite you all to join the conversation.
Okay, it's great to be here at William & Mary. I actually had prepared slides for this audience. As you can see, this is a version of this talk I gave at Stanford, but for some reason my laptop screwed up the fonts and the colors, and so you're going to have to bear with this one. Can you all hear me okay? All right. So I'm also really impressed that I filled a room on the topic of delegation, because this is not an obvious, sexy issue that everybody is dying to hear about, but I want to try to explain to you why it's, to me, become one of the most important issues in politics, and I'll try to explain at the end why it's particularly relevant at this moment, when you have a president that's trying to indict Jim Comey and put him in jail. The problem of delegation, I think, will become evident at that point. All right, so I'm going to walk you through a kind of intellectual journey about how a bunch of different concepts come together to point to this question of delegation as being important. And the goal of this is actually how to fix the US government and how to make it actually work better, because delegation is critical to that. So we have to begin with just some theory. The world is full of hierarchical organizations. Initially, economists didn't take this seriously because in a market economy, everybody is just operating, interacting with each other. But for some reason, there are these large hierarchical corporations like General Motors or Ford or whatever. And a question that occurred in the 1930s is, why do you have firms at all? Why can't you just decentralize everything and have a lot of little companies all get together and coordinate? The gentleman that worked on a theory of this was Ronald Coase, a Nobel Prize winner. He wrote a very important article in the 1930s called The Theory of the Firm, and he said the reason that you have hierarchical organizations is due to transaction costs, because to coordinate the behavior of a lot of little companies it's too burdensome. You have to have a lot of lawyers, contracts, litigation, and so forth. If you just have a single hierarchy, you can order, you guys supply this to this other part of the organization, and that's that. Now, with the rise of the internet in the 1990s, people began to wonder about this theory because what does the internet do? It facilitates horizontal communications. And the idea was, now that anyone can connect with anyone else, maybe you don't need so much hierarchy in the world. Maybe everybody actually can coordinate in a horizontal way. This also corresponds to a certain democratic impulse. Nobody likes to obey orders from somebody in authority. And wouldn't it be great if you could organize a world in which nobody was on top of anybody else and everybody just worked together in horizontal fashion to produce things. And so I'm just giving you these bibliographic citations if you should ever want to actually follow some of the original sources for that, right? So people began thinking about electronic mediation as a way of overcoming the need for hierarchy. And you had a lot of theorizing about complex adaptive systems. There's this place called the Santa Fe Institute that was devoted to the idea of spontaneous order, where you didn't have to have a hierarchical authority in order to get people to work together. Now, this didn't work so well. If you've ever been in a committee where there's no boss and you try to come to a consensus, you'll see what the problem with horizontal coordination is. It's very difficult to achieve, and ultimately, in human organizations, you really do have to have a final source of authority that can say, okay, enough discussion, this is what we're going to do, right? But it did lead to a lot of theorizing, and theories particularly in the form of something called principal agent theory, which is the dominant paradigm by which economists think about hierarchical organization. It's not rocket science, right? Principal agent theory says a hierarchy starts with a principal who is, in effect, the boss. The principal has the legitimate authority to make decisions and delegates authority to a series of agents underneath. And the problem in many organizations is that the agents don't do what the principal wants. The agents have their own motives and incentives. And if they don't align with those of the principal, then you get something, for example, like corruption, right? You had Enron or WorldCom. You had these big corporations that fell apart in the 1990s because somebody below the principal decided to put money in their own bank account rather than sending it to the corporate treasury. And so economists began to define corruption, the problem of corruption, as a principal agent problem where the incentives of the agents were not aligned with those of the principal. That's why Silicon Valley firms give out stock options, because instead of getting money from your salary, if you get your money from an appreciating stock price, presumably you care more about the collective outcome of the company, the collective welfare of the company, rather than your own narrow self-interest, right? Now, the problem with principal agent is actually pretty severe. And I think it's actually a poor way of thinking about how hierarchies actually work. There are a couple of people that I mentioned here. So Herbert Simon was a great theorist of public administration, and he noted many decades ago that in actual hierarchies, authority does not necessarily travel from the principal down to different levels of agents. In fact, authority oftentimes goes in the opposite direction from the agents up to the principals. And the reason for that is very simple. A lot of times the agents are the ones that have the skills, knowledge, and expertise that the principals lack. And in many organizations, the senior vice president isn't going to know what the hell to do unless he's told by his subordinates, no, actually, we tried that before. You don't understand, that's not going to work. We got to do something else. And that's a case, I don't know, there was this British comedy series called Yes, Minister that came out in the 1980s. Really hilarious because the chief minister in one of the cabinet departments basically had the political principle, the minister, wrapped around his little finger because he was the one that knew actually how that particular ministry worked, and the political principal simply couldn't act without being told what to do by his deputy, right? So this is a truth, I think, that exists in many organizations. The other thing, this John DiIulio piece at the bottom on principled agents also indicates that a lot of times the principal is actually not controlling the agent. The agent is controlling themselves, and it's done normatively because the agents really have the motivation and the knowledge. Now, there's one other important article along these lines. This is, I think, one of the best things that Friedrich Hayek ever wrote. It was, so he's the dean of libertarian economists. He wrote this article back in the 1940s called The Uses of Knowledge in Society. And he pointed out that in a modern economy, like 99% of the factual information that's necessary to make the economy work is local in nature. And who has local knowledge? Is it the corporate vice president sitting in a glass tower at headquarters, or is it the factory floor worker that is receiving a part and realizes it doesn't fit, right? It's the factory floor worker. And therefore, if you don't decentralize authority in a modern organization, you're not going to get it to work because the principal doesn't have sufficient local knowledge. He was using this to demonstrate why a market economy should work better than a centrally planned economy, because in a centrally planned economy, there's a guy at the top that is allocating resources throughout the whole economy, and they have no idea what's actually going on at the bottom level. They don't have any kind of local knowledge. So it's another reason why it is important to delegate authority in any hierarchy, all right? Now, the problem, of course, is that if you delegate too much authority to low-level agents, you're going to lose control of the organization. And it could also lead to disaster if you delegate too much authority. And particularly if you delegate too much authority to somebody that's incompetent or corrupt. There's a case in the 1990s of a venerable British financial institution, Barings Bank, that allowed a single young trader named Nick Leeson to, in effect, bet the whole firm. He bet the wrong way, and the bank went bankrupt, right? So you don't want to give too much authority to people that cannot use that authority properly. And that's why it's hard, actually, to solve the problem of delegation in any organization, because you need to delegate authority for reasons of local knowledge. The local agents can act more quickly and so forth, but you risk losing control of the organization as a whole, or you get into problems of corruption, incompetence, and so forth. Now, there are a number of ways of controlling agents. There are formal mechanisms that any organization has. So you've got transparency and accountability rules. You have to be able to watch what the agents are doing and make sure that they're doing the right thing that the principal wants. I talked about stock options as a way of aligning incentives, but there's also informal mechanisms for controlling the behavior of agents, and that's where the trust issue comes in, because you're not going to delegate authority to an agent that you don't trust, and trust is a result of competence, expertise, experience. If the agent doesn't have those qualities, you're not going to trust them to make good decisions. That means that things like organizational culture are very important, because that's a way of controlling agents. If everybody in the organization has a sense of duty towards the organization as a whole, you're going to be able to trust the agents to do the right thing in different circumstances. And that's really what we mean by state capacity. In any government organization, if you don't have people that have the right knowledge, skills, ability to actually do the jobs that they're assigned, the organization is not going to work. So this is something that Steve's written about in The Assault on the State. There's a lot of people that, for some reason, don't think that state capacity is important. We have an administration in Washington that, as we speak, is trying to destroy as much state capacity as possible by randomly firing, federal workers without knowing what they do or why they're important and so forth, right? And so building state capacity by having agents to carry out the instructions of the principal is really important for the success of any government. Now, trust is critical, so I mentioned the importance of that as a way of assuring yourself that the agents actually know what they're going to do. Now, I'm going to give you two concrete examples that in my intellectual development were really important in making me realize the importance of delegation. So the first one is just-in-time manufacturing. Right, this was a system that Toyota created back in the 1950s in which you delegate to factory floor workers authority over quality control. So in Toyota's just-in-time system, you had these very lean inventories, but you also gave workers a cord at every workstation on the factory floor, and if they saw a defect in the supply chain, in the production process, they saw that they were getting a door panel that didn't fit, then they could pull the chain and the entire production line would grind to a halt. And the reason they did this was to give everybody a very powerful incentive not to let these quality problems seep in. And so if you saw that you weren't getting the right type of screw or the right kind of door panel, you would impose a big cost on the whole organization, and that would force the managers to fix the problem at the source. In American factories at that point, they would allow the defect to go all the way, and then they try to fix them at a rework area at the end of the production line. And that's the reason that Toyota developed the kind of reputation for quality that it did in the 1980s and 90s, because they were fixing these quality problems at the source using their empowered factory floor workers to notice where the defects were entering in. And basically, by the end of the 1990s, every American car company had adopted some form of this Kanban or just-in-time system for similar kinds of reasons. Now, the other reason that I began to understand the importance of delegation has to do with military organization. The US Army did not do well in the Vietnam War. And after the war in the 1970s, the Army as an institution did a lot of soul searching and analysis of why there had been these kinds of failures in command. And what they came up with was a version of what the German Army called Auftragstaktik, which was a recognition that in a good army, you have to delegate as much authority as possible to the lowest possible command level, right? You're assaulting a building, you think there's a terrorist in there, who's going to know the tactical situation? Is it the second lieutenant on the ground with a platoon that's trying to assault the building, or is it a general in headquarters, 100 clicks behind the front lines? It's obviously the local officer. And the best armies in the world are ones that delegate authority to the greatest extent possible. Obviously, the general is needed to come up with the overall strategic idea, but under what's now called mission orders, you have this decentralized command where authority is delegated to low-level officers on the ground that can take advantage of local knowledge. If you want to know why the Ukrainian army has done so well against the Russian army, that is exactly the difference. That the Ukrainians have actually taken a lot of training from the US military, and they've gone, they've created this highly decentralized system where the local brigade commanders can take decisions without having to refer it to any higher level political authority. The Russian army is like the old Soviet army. Nobody can take a decision independently. They've got to refer it up the chain of command. That slows things down. It reduces the degree of innovation. And so good armies basically have this kind of doctrine of maximum amount of delegation in tactical situations, right? So these are just two examples, real-world examples of where delegation is really important in improving performance. Okay, so this is the big question which over the years I've come to recognize as the central question in organization theory. That's true in private sector corporations, it's true in the government, it's true in your garden club, if you're trying to get your garden club to work better. How much authority should you delegate? This is something that political scientists have written about. There's a literature that describes bureaucratic autonomy and the way that it's worked in government organizations, in private sector organizations, and the like, which has basically said that those organizations that delegate more authority appropriately will perform better than ones that are over-centralized, right? That micromanage the behavior of agents. Now, you have a conundrum. This came up when I was thinking about development practice. I did a lot of work with the World Bank, and the World Bank had this belief that comes from Bob Klitgaard, who is one of the great experts on corruption, where he said that the degree of corruption is a product of the amount of monopoly plus discretion minus accountability, meaning that if you have an agency that has a monopolistic control over a certain function like customs, clearing customs, and you give them a lot of discretion, and they're not held accountable for bad decisions, you're going to get lots of corruption. Now, this is true in almost every developing country. One of the most corrupt ministries is always the customs ministry. Why is that the case? It's because a customs agent, you think about it, all these containers are coming through the port or the airport or off the container ship. The customs agent cannot inspect every container that comes through. They say, okay, this one, this one, this one, and that opens the door. The discretion that they have opens the door to corruption because somebody comes and says, hey, don't look inside this container, here's a payment, just let this one through and everything will be fine, right? And this is the source of really major, in fact, the Indonesians had such a problem with corruption in their customs agency that they outsourced the entire function to a Swiss company operating out of Singapore because they couldn't trust their own people to behave in an uncorrupt fashion, right? So he was arguing that you want to minimize the amount of discretionary authority that your agents had. But I began to look at the political science literature that was saying, no, you actually have to give as much authority as possible to your lower level agents. So how do you reconcile this? Why is one person saying, reduce the amount of discretion, and the other saying, no, you have to maximize discretion? So I had a theory about this, which was something like this, that there's actually an optimal degree of discretion that you want to allocate. You don't want to give too much discretion because then your bureaucrat can run wild and make all sorts of mistakes and not obey orders and so forth. But you don't want to reduce the amount of discretion to such a point that the agent is completely constrained, can't make decisions quickly, has to refer everything up to the big boss. And therefore, there'd be this inverted U where you'd have an optimal degree not too much, it's kind of a Goldilocks outcome, not too much, not too little discretion. But the question is, where is the maximum point of that inverted U? How much discretion should you allocate? And this was the theory that I had, that the appropriate amount of discretion should depend on the capacity of the underlying function. So I'll illustrate this by comparing the US Federal Reserve to your TSA agents that make you take your shoes off when you go through to get on an airplane, right? The average staff member at the Federal Reserve, the US Federal Reserve, is a PhD economist or somebody that's had massive experience in financial markets, right? The Fed is one of the most high capacity agencies anywhere in the world. On the other hand, TSA, they deliberately said that they don't want to have highly educated people working there because they didn't want to pay very much, right? So the average TSA agent is just a high school graduate. And the question is, who's got the more, who's given the more discretion? If you think about the Fed, they make these incredibly complex decisions. We're going to bail out this bank, but not this bank. And they're given the authority to make those decisions on their own authority, right? And they are given that discretion because they are all very, very knowledgeable experts in financial markets, whereas the TSA agent is not terribly well educated. I mean, if you think about what a really competent security screener has to do, they have to not base their decisions on stereotypes or profiling. They actually have to use a fair amount of knowledge about who's likely to be a terrorist, who looks suspicious, who is deliberately trying to avoid suspicion, this sort of thing. Now, some countries like Israel actually invest a lot in their security screeners, and they're able to actually give them the authority to make these kinds of these decisions. In the United States, we decided we're not going to go for a high capacity TSA, and therefore everybody has to operate by these rules that take away discretion. So you basically can't single out somebody in a turban just because he said, well, that looks like a Muslim terrorist, right? They're not allowed to make decisions of that sort. So that kind of illustrates the general principle. The more capacity your agents have, the more authority it's safe to delegate to them, okay? So pretty straightforward idea. Now, I think that at this point in the development literature, it's pretty clear that state capacity is important. There was a period, let's say 30 years ago, when most development economists thought that development depended on economic factors, like who's got resources and who's got a favorable trading position and this sort of thing. I think right now, with the rise of institutional economics, there's been this recognition that actually the single thing that is the most important is state capacity and the quality of states. That the reason that East Asia has developed so much faster than the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, is that the countries of East Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, have all had very high quality states from way before, the whole colonial period. These things developed very early in their history, whereas, much of the rest of the developing world really didn't even have a modern state until, fairly recently, and that institutional quality was really what explained the superior, you take a country like Japan or Korea, they don't have any natural resources. Another comparison is, let's say, between Nigeria and Norway. They're both oil-rich countries, but Norway has a very high-quality state, and so most of the revenues that they've gotten from their oil, they've actually put in a sovereign wealth fund, salting it away for a rainy day. Nigeria, with a very low-quality government, has got endemic corruption and remains highly impoverished despite all of the oil wealth that they've got. And the difference between those countries really has to do with state capacity, right? So that is all important. So let me get on to the United States, right? Because the question of delegation has become absolutely central to American politics at the present moment. there is a conservative critique of the administrative state that really gets going with the expansion of the American government in the 1930s under the New Deal. Conservatives really didn't like this, and they have a narrative about what's wrong with the bureaucracy. So they argue that in American government, we have delegated too much power to unelected bureaucrats who then have a left-wing bias, and they're making all sorts of decisions on behalf of Americans as a whole, outside of the authority of their elected officials. Has anyone heard this line before, right?
Yeah.
Heard the term the deep state, and suspicion of the deep state. So this is a persistent complaints, and many conservatives have basically said we have to reduce the authority of these bureaucrats. We have to constrain them in a whole bunch of ways, possibly by firing them or just getting them out of the decision-making loop, right? So that's a very common thing. One of the deepest aspects of American political culture is distrust of government. This is not the same in Europe. It's not the same in Japan or Korea. Most of the other developed democracies around the world actually think their governments play important functions, that they actually do important things. Americans have this deep tradition of suspicion of state authority, and therefore a deep suspicion of their own bureaucracy. So this is the general political background for what's going on right now. Well, I would say that the conservative charge about unelected bureaucrats running wild is true in certain sectors. There are certain particular agencies and certain decisions in particular agencies where there actually has been a lack of political control over bureaucrats' behavior. But there are plenty of mechanisms in the American system for controlling them. You can control them by ex-ante rules. So you can tell the bureaucrats, no, you can't make a decision unless you follow the following procedures. You can hold them accountable after the fact. You can appoint the right bureaucrats, and you can remove the wrong ones. And then finally, you can intervene in a lot of ad hoc ways. And removal power has become, for conservatives, the central mechanism by which they hope to control what they regard as an out-of-control bureaucracy. So what did Elon Musk do when he was made the head of the Department of Government Efficiency back last January? He began to fire bureaucrats. He fired bureaucrats in a completely arbitrary way, not understanding what it was they did, but he figured most of them are just sitting around playing video games at home, and so they're not doing anything particularly important. So that's one approach to bureaucratic reform. Now, this is a slide. I had prepared a whole nother slide that got lost when I tried to use my laptop to do the editing, but let me tell you about it, because it gets down to the question of the indictment of James Comey, all right? Beginning in the 1880s, with the passage of something called the Pendleton Act, Congress began to start making rules for how the executive branch could hire and fire its personnel. Pendleton Act was the first moment at which the US government began to require that people actually pass an exam to become a civil servant. Prior to that, we were in something called the patronage or the spoils system, where federal officials were simply paid off for their political support by a politician that said, okay, you can be a postmaster, you can run the customs house because you were my political supporter. So with the Pendleton Act, Congress began to say, no, you have to take a civil service exam, you have to have the right qualifications, you're not going to get promoted unless you demonstrate your competence in a certain area. That's the way a modern bureaucracy is supposed to work. We were very late to this game because most other countries had already instituted some kind of a merit system for their bureaucracies long before the United States did it, right? And so Congress started to basically tell the executive branch how to handle its own personnel. right? And they set conditions for removal. So for example, there are about 200 officials in the federal bureaucracy that occupy senior policy positions that are so-called for-cause, they're protected by a requirement for what's called for-cause removal, meaning Congress says the president cannot simply fire these officials on a whim. You have to actually have a reason for firing them. There's a judicial process that you go through to see whether you can actually remove that official. Conservatives have hated this idea, and they have advocated something called the theory of the unitary executive, which maintains that the president alone should have complete authority over the entire executive branch, and therefore should be able to fire any official within the executive branch that they want. And presidents have respected this rule up until the Trump administration. But beginning on January 20th, Trump started issuing executive orders to fire a whole bunch of different officials. A lot of members of multi-member commissions like the FTC, the EEOC, so forth. We got this alphabet soup of federal agencies that are headed by these multi-member commissions. He fired inspectors general that are protected by for-cause removal. The one that's currently in the news is Lisa Cook. So she is a member of the Federal Reserve Board. And actually, they did come up with an invented cause for firing her, which is, I think if you look at the details, pretty phony, but he's tried to fire her. The Supreme Court, by the way, just told the administration that they, for the time being, cannot fire her because she still is, under that kind of job protection. However, and by the way, there was a 1935 Supreme Court decision called Humphrey's Executor that explicitly gave Congress the right to set rules for hiring and firing of federal officials. A lot of conservatives, including the conservative members of the current Roberts Supreme Court, think that Humphrey's Executor was bad jurisprudence. They think that, the doctrine of the unitary executive should give the president the right to fire anyone they want. It gets a little bit tricky with the case of the Federal Reserve because the markets actually care that the Federal Reserve is independent of presidential authority. They don't trust President Trump to appoint, a Federal Reserve chair and commissioners that will actually guard against inflation. And so the markets themselves have been very worried about this. However, my prediction is that by the end of the year, Humphrey's Executor will be gone. Jerome Powell will be out of a job. Now, if you think about what's going on in the US government, remember I said that the degree to which you can trust an agent depends on their capacity. And most of these congressional interventions in the organization of the executive branch have been there to protect expertise. That you can't just fire whoever you want on the Federal Reserve Board because you don't like their inflation policy. They're the experts, and you have to respect that expertise, and the markets really care about that. And I think that's the big question that is facing the country right now. Do you want a federal bureaucracy that actually prizes knowledge, expertise, skill, experience, and do you want to limit the power of the person who is elected president to impede the operation of these highly technical agencies? Or do you think that because the president is elected, he should have the right to basically do whatever he wants? My view is obviously that you do want to maintain those protections, but I think that is the really big delegation issue that is facing us. We have to delegate substantial authority to experts in our government, and right now there's a big political movement to, in effect, take away that delegated authority. Right, that's it. That's what I wanted to talk about, so thanks very much. I'll give this over to.
Let's see if this works. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, good. Thank you, Professor Fukuyama, for that tour de force through basic theory to the present day in a way that really does kind of show the logical connections. And I want to make sure we have time for audience questions. So I'm only going to ask you a couple of follow-ups.
Yeah, sorry, I took too long.
No, it was completely the way to go. So my first question has to do with the communications problem. By the way, I have to say, as a person who spent over a decade as a Commonwealth of Virginia state official, it's music to my ears. More autonomy for me would have been a good idea. But that's not how our fellow citizens necessarily see it.
Yeah.
And in an environment of social media and polarization and distrust, as you said earlier, that goes back a long way. How do we get this lecture to be sort of, bite-sized enough it could make it onto TikTok or, other things that would reach people?
Yeah, that is really hard. Actually, I forgot, I got a couple of slides that actually kind of address this. So this is the basic communications problem. I think that the conservative narrative that the bureaucracy is out of control is 180 degrees incorrect. The problem with the American bureaucracy is that it is over-constrained, that there are too many rules that bureaucrats have to follow. That's why, you're at the DMV and, you didn't sign in the right place, or it's 1 minute after 5 o'clock, so the bureaucrat says, sorry, we're closed now. Why do bureaucrats behave that way? It's that they've got all these rules that they are meant to follow, and if they don't follow the rules, they're going to not get their promotion, and it doesn't matter that they're not serving citizens in the way they should be. So the communications problem is, how do you convince Americans that they kind of believe the opposite of the truth, that the big problem is really not out of control bureaucrats, it's over-controlled bureaucrats. And I have to say, I don't have a simple answer. There's no TikTok video that I can imagine will convince people of this. I think that really what you have to do is start making arguments. You can begin with examples. So for example, one of my colleagues at Stanford has a reg lab. It's a lab looking at regulations where he has tried to count the number of federally mandated annual reports that federal agencies have to file with Congress every year. And he says he doesn't know the true number, but it's over 10,000, right? And so if you say, what do bureaucrats spend their time doing in the federal government? Part of the answer is they're filling out these completely useless reports that nobody will read, but there's a statute that says they've got to do it. Or if you want to buy a desk or a computer in a federal agency, you've got to follow the federal acquisitions regulations that amount to several thousand pages of detailed rules about how you buy something. Right? In the private sector, you don't have to do that sort of thing. And so I think that maybe by giving people a few ideas for why the government actually doesn't work and isn't responsive, maybe you can start convincing people. It all has to start with elites, by the way. I mean, I think that if too many elites believe the wrong narrative about what's wrong with the government, you're not going to make any headway. But that's why I like talking to audiences like this, because maybe people with more knowledge and influence, if they get convinced that the narrative they believed up till now is really incorrect, then maybe that's the start of changing people's views on this.
So I'm going to follow up on the first major book, The End of History and the Last Man, because I know a lot of people in the audience will be interested in your views. Do we need a narrative of historical progress to get through the crisis? And here's where I see the connection. Trust is broken, there's no easy narrative. But if you believe the arc of history bends toward justice, as Dr. King said, then you could kind of shoulder the burden for a while thinking this is inevitably going to come around. And that was a Hegelian view.
Yeah.
So are we at the kind of antithesis of the thesis and ready for synthesis, or are we not going to go there?
Well, so I can't make any predictions about exactly where we are in that arc. And history is not linear. It's just not linear. You have advance and then you have setbacks, right? So you think about the 1930s. You had communism, you had fascism, you had all of these anti-democratic, very powerful movements. and somehow we got through that, and after 1945 you had the birth of a new liberal order that democratized a far larger part of the world than had been the case before. So I think the narrative about progress is important so that you don't give up. You don't start thinking to yourself at any point that decay is inevitable and we're just going to end up back in the Stone Age at the end of this process. I wrote a 2-volume series on political order it was my effort to rewrite The End of History and The Last Man, where I actually don't begin with early humans, I begin with primates, the pre-human precursors of human beings. And the effort there is actually to show that there has been political development since roughly 40,000 BC, right? Very long historical arc. But I think that it's just incontrovertible that there's been progress over time. Mm-hmm. If you don't believe that, I would say, move to Guatemala or to Myanmar or to some other badly governed, corrupt, very poor society and try living there for a while, right? If you really think that the setbacks that we have experienced in the United States, are inevitable decline. The difference between a poorly governed, desperately poor country with very few opportunities for your children and so forth is, something that anyone can experience, and it exists in many places around the world. If you don't believe in progress, just try going to a country like that and saying, where's life better, right? So I think that that's my ultimate answer, that there has been progress. You should never forget how lucky you are to actually be living in the kind of society that you're living in, whatever the problems you're currently experiencing.
So it leads to my last question, and I'll be brief because of time. There's this dilemma with the government shutdown, for example, the General Trump administration attacks on the administrative state, where the effects eventually, logically, following your argument, would be Myanmar or Guatemala or that kind of outcome. But people will feel it earlier than that.
Yeah.
So is the government shutdown a moment of, kind of realization for the wider public, or is it later that process happens? How do you kind of see the feedback mechanism working?
Well, we've had, I don't know, how many shutdowns have we had now total? I mean, it's like at least half a dozen in the last generation. And so far, that has not convinced people that their government is important and, something that needs to be protected. So I have no confidence that the current shutdown is actually going to have that impact. And in fact, we've kind of learned to live with shutdowns and kind of reduce their impact. I think that what could happen is with this much more systematic attack on state capacity, that maybe people will begin to realize that actually having a competent government is something they can't take for granted when it disappears. And, there are other things that will happen beyond the shutdown that I think, in terms of public health, are you kidding me? We actually start advising parents not to vaccinate their children, and measles and polio and all these diseases start coming back. You think that people aren't going to notice that, something really went wrong, if there's a cause and effect between, undermining state capacity and really bad outcomes for people. So, I'm hopeful that recognition will set in, but, it's going to take time.
It'll take time, yeah. Thank you so much. I'm not going to take any more time because I know people would like to ask questions. We're going to take 3 at a time. And please keep them brief. Say your name, brief question, and no mini lectures, please. So we'll take 3 and then kind of.
Yeah.
Hi, Professor. My name is Danny Roque. I just wanted to ask really quickly, do you think the problem is that people have an issue with the definition of deregulation, and then do they equate that to lower state capacity? Thank you.
Hi, Professor. My name is Shri, and my question for you is, does agent capacity take into account intrinsic motivations and potential for corruption, or is it purely expertise? And if the capacity doesn't take this into consideration, how can we choose highly qualified agents that also have little motivation to defect or pursue self-enrichment? Thank you.
Hi, thank you for doing this. I'm a great admirer of your work. My question is, how is it where I saw a video of yours where you said that the issue with the neoliberal order declining was too much financial deregulation.
Hold the mic close to your mouth.
Sorry. So my question would be, how are we not repeating this by, letting go, deregulating federal workers, delegating too much? How do we avoid too much deregulation? Where do you draw the line on that?
Okay, maybe I can answer the first and the third at the same moment. There's unfortunately two ideological discussion about regulation in this country, where conservatives attack all forms of regulation and progressives tend to support it. And I think that's the wrong attitude, because there is a lot of regulation that's absolutely necessary. If you take it away, if you take away the FDA's ability to certify drugs and pharmaceuticals, you're going to get in big trouble. But then there's a lot of unnecessary regulation that is actually being very counterproductive. And the worst way you can approach this is by some ideological mindset that says, oh, you want to deregulate, you must be some horrible conservative, or the opposite. I think that you have to look at the specific regulation and decide whether it is doing more harm than good. The other thing I would say, the one area where I differ from a lot of conservatives is that I actually think the first part of the American system that needs to be deregulated is actually the bureaucracy. It's not the private sector. There's plenty in the private sector that could stand a little deregulation, but I actually think that you need to start by giving public officials more authority to actually make decisions without having to comply with all of these detailed rules. But that's my general answer. Sometimes it's absolutely necessary, and other times it's harmful. Now, on the question of motivation of public servants, it's absolutely intrinsic motivation, right? It's not just expertise and knowledge. If you do not have a sense of public, if you don't have an intrinsic public service motivation, you're going to take a bribe if you think you can get away with it, right? Or you're going to act in ways that are going to harm the public, but you don't care because you don't have this stronger sense. There's several cases of this. In India, there's a very famous study done by Jean Drèze that showed that Indian school teachers in Uttar Pradesh were not showing up for work. And one of the solutions that they came up with was to actually put little TV cameras in every classroom to see whether the teacher was showing up or not. And it turned out that this intervention made no difference at all, because the teachers figured out how to disable the camera, or they called in sick, or one thing or another. Now, Finland, on the PISA scores, always comes out at the top as having one of the best public education systems. They do not have cameras in Finnish classrooms. What they have are highly motivated teachers with a very strong public service motivation that makes them want to do the best job that they can as public school teachers. So that's part of their training. And it is absolutely part of state capacity, to have that public service orientation, so that, is it easier to control people with an external monitoring device like a TV camera, or is it better to try to control them because they want to do well, right? It's obviously the latter. They need to monitor themselves. And so if you do not have a culture that supports a public service orientation, you're never going to get the kind of performance out of a public servant that you would, in other ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were talking in class about principal agent theory, And in a way, the assumption you can't understand intrinsic motivation because economic actors are utility maximizers, so you drop out the intrinsic.
Yeah.
But then, of course, if that's vital, you've dropped out something quite important.
Yeah, so I cited that John DiIulio argument about principled agents, and that's exactly what he argues. He begins with this story about a prison riot in Texas where the riot got out of control and virtually every prison director, retired prison director in the state, just dropped what they were doing and came to the site of the riot to help get the thing under control. They didn't have to do it, but his point was that these people were acting out of this intrinsic, public service motivation. They did not have to be ordered to do this. They weren't compensated for it, but they did it because they thought it was the right thing. And the whole point is that sometimes the agents do the right thing because they're principled and not because they're being, it's not the good thing the economists aren't in charge of this, because they would say, oh no, you got to offer them a bonus or jack up their pay or something like that, and they don't understand the importance of intrinsic motivation.
Yeah. But let's do 3 more.
Kind of alluded to this.
What's your name, sir?
Oh, sorry. My name is Carson. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to ask, and you kind of alluded to this earlier when you were talking about the need to remain optimistic. But do you still subscribe to your thesis in the end of history, or do you think it needs to be modified, or what?
Okay.
Hello, my name is Isabel. Thank you for coming. My question is just, how do you think states with high state capacity or who have already kind of had success with delegation can help those states that are maybe not as successful in these areas that you kind of mentioned towards the end of your talk? Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Ian. I wanted to ask about the current status of the DoD in the wake of what had happened on Tuesday with Secretary Hegseth addressing the 800 senior-most officials in the DoD, because it seems that he is decreasing the informal mechanisms of control, it's sort of increasing the formal ones. I was curious, do you think that this shift in DoD's exercise of principal agent theory, how do you think this affects the discretionary ability of the rest of the agents, given the size and capacity of that state mechanism?
Okay. So let me answer these in reverse order. I think that so my assumption is that the vast majority of those flag officers in that meeting came away just appalled at what they had been exposed to. And I think that that is a result of this very deep socialization that is true of virtually every senior officer in the US military. Now, what's going to be dangerous is not getting a lecture from the president and from Pete Hegseth. What's going to be dangerous, and actually a number of officers have already, senior officers have already been fired. But if the administration actually starts conditioning promotions, on the basis of loyalty, personal loyalty to Donald Trump, and that this goes on for long enough, then that is unfortunately, I think, that's what's really going to start changing their behavior. Not a single speech, but things that really affect your career path. I'm sorry, so remind me, your question.
There was an end of history question,
Oh, yeah, okay.
and there was a question about how the good states that know how to do delegation
Yeah,
can help
so, the good states setting good examples, these things are noticed by experts, people like Steve and me and so forth. But I think that actually state behavior is so culturally embedded that it's very, very difficult to, the worst one is Singapore, because in the development business, people are always saying, well, look at Singapore, they're doing it so great, and just behave like Singaporeans. And nobody can do that because, nobody's got Singapore's particular circumstances and culture. And so I think it's actually actively unhelpful to, to try to refer to these other models because they're very hard to replicate. Just to give you one example, in my class, we have a lot of students from a lot of different parts of the world, and there's this case of brick kilns in Bangladesh, which were very, they polluted a lot, they're very bad for public health, and the question was, you got to replace them with gas-fired kilns. And so the Chinese students in the class said, well, why don't you just sanction the people that don't convert to the gas-fired kilns? That's what we do in China. All the students in the class from South Asia started laughing. And they said, you just don't understand South Asia. We can't do that in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or India because our government doesn't have that kind of authority, right? So there's just differences that, make it very hard to translate practices in one society to the other. Now, on the question of the end of history, I guess I have two different answers. One is that I've already modified the theory. So my two political order books were actually were an effort to rewrite the end of history in two respects. So the first one was, when I wrote the original end of history, I didn't understand the importance of a modern impersonal state. And that's something I corrected in the political order books. The other was that I didn't have a concept of political decay, where a country could be we used to, in political science, we had this term, a consolidated democracy, as if democracy were a one-way ratchet, and once you became consolidated, you couldn't fall backwards. That's just bullshit. I mean, it's just not, I think the United States has demonstrated that, the most developed democracy can always go backwards, and so that was something that I hadn't really adequately thought about. But there's kind of a deeper question about what was the end of history about. And I would say the easiest way to put it is that the idea that was articulated first in the French Revolution of the equality of dignity, that all human beings have an intrinsic dignity that has to be respected by giving them rights, is a very powerful idea that was beating all of the other authoritarian ideas that were out there. And I still believe that that's the case. The question I've constantly asked any of the critics of the end of history is, okay, you think that liberal order is defective. What alternative system would you put in place that is systematically different? And what would that look like? And I've not yet heard a good answer to that, because I think a lot of the contemporary critics of that very spare understanding of liberalism ultimately believe some version of it. Even the Chinese government, claims that they're democratic. It's just democratic socialism. They claim that the people rule, and what they're doing is respecting the people's rights. Just they do it in a slightly different way than they do in the West. But they don't contest the underlying theory. Now, there are people on the extreme right that have begun to introduce genuinely anti-liberal doctrines, like this guy Curtis Yarvin, and it's been picked up by some of these kind of lunatics out there that say, we actually do need hierarchy. Some people are intrinsically better than other people. A lot of people in Silicon Valley seem to believe this, right, because they're so rich, right, that means that they've got a right to rule. But who else believes something like that? That's not a billionaire. I mean, this is not a winning argument in a place like the United States. So I think that it's still the case that that underlying principle remains pretty solid despite a lot of unhappiness with it.
So this is really sad, but we are at time. I want to say a couple of words in closing. One is just, I've had the pleasure and honor today to spend much of the day with Professor Fukuyama. And it is really clear, as you can see from this talk, it's an inexhaustible font of intellectual inquiry and wisdom that we have here today. And also, I want to plug a new book coming out, I hear, which is Professor Fukuyama's memoirs, which will be out maybe a year, 2, 3, somewhere in that area.
It'll be out next summer.
Next summer, so
Yeah.
even better.
No, it's written already. So.
Oh, okay, so I'm glad I'm plugging it. Because the two political order books, you must read them, Liberalism and its Discontents, which came out in 2022. Every one of these is just deeply rewarding. So it was wonderful to have you here, Frank, and everybody, please join me in a round of applause.